Nazis targeted youth and featured youth in their propaganda before and after coming to power. Could you please tell us how did it develop throughout the years, from the early years of the Nazi Party in early 1920s to when it came to power in 1933 until its downfall in 1945?
So before the Nazis came to power in 1933, they had instigated the Hitler Youth. So these would be a well-run and well-integrated part of the Nazi Party for young people. And so these would be associations that would work, that would play together, work together after school. And so the idea was to build these communities of like-minded individuals. And of course, for the Nazis, it meant only those who they deemed worthy of being part of their community. And it actually, at one time, it became a law that people had to join the German Hitler Youth, because what they did after they came to power was to eliminate and get rid of other youth organizations. So any of the competition from other youth organizations were slowly gotten rid of.
So from the movement's inception, the Nazi Party is hoping really to mold children and juveniles to their purposes. And by 1930, even before Hitler comes to power, it's recruited about 20,000 members. And following the Nazi assumption of power, they have a new Reich youth leader. It's placed under the leadership of Walter von Schirach. Hitler Youths receive both physical and paramilitary training, as well as ideological indoctrination. A key component of Schirach's strategy is to create from Hitler's young ranks of boys and later girls, and that's something we should probably talk about, competent and loyal soldiers for its future wars, and also citizens who are ideologically committed to the Third Reich.
So if you can just tell us about this image that the little boy is saying that the Jews, they have crooked noses, which look like number 6.
Here we see anti-Semitism, obviously, that the Jew is the other and the most dangerous other. He's ugly, he's everywhere, he's ubiquitous, and he's dangerous for German society. So this is a conduit for Nazi ideology and for their racialist ideology and policies. The largest arena for the indoctrination of German youth is really by far the classroom. And, you've, just to give a little background before I talk about the image itself, in April 1933, you have the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, and that purges civil servants. Most teachers in Germany are civil servants. That purges those ranks of Jews and anyone who's considered politically unreliable. And the majority of teachers that remain, 97% of educators join the National Socialist Teachers League. And that is a really large number. A lot of them join the Nazi Party in large numbers. And so you see teachers as a real conduit for students to teach their particular slant on racial science and science.
I have two questions that but are somehow related. So I would like to know what type of sexuality was allowed and what was the multitude of it, and to what extent individuals and citizens under Nazi state were allowed to kind of explore their sexuality. And the other question is also regarding masculinity, because I also heard in what you said about, I felt like this emphasis on maleness, like guys, like male youth, kind of, they had disadvantages to join the army and be the good soldiers.
So it's interesting that when the Nazis came to power and in the 1920s, they very much saw themselves as the party of a moral family structure. And in fact, if you think, there's a lot of, people know about Berlin in the 1920s, for example, of the, sort of the free love, free spirit. Women have been transformed out of the house. They're living in Berlin. And so the structures of the family have broken down. And so that was a powerful message that the Nazis, as well as other conservative political parties, the Catholic Party and some of the German nationalist parties, used as a way to try to differentiate themselves from the communists and the socialists. And so there was a movement by the Nazis to clean up the streets of Berlin. There was Schundenschmutz. This is my dissertations on Schundenschmutz. It focused on trash and filth, and whether that was pornography that was being sold on the streets, but not just sexual pornography, but novels and films that excited the youth, like encouraged their imagination. So movies and books about pirates and cops and robbers and Indians were banned, or the Nazis found them to be offensive because it affected and sort of distracted youth from the importance of thinking about a good moral family background and to establish families and to have children and to grow and to prosper. So we find that when the Nazis came to power, some of the first things they did was clean up the streets of Berlin and the big cities of this Schundenschmutz. They outlawed nude sunbathing. So these were things that many middle-class Germans who may not have believed the Nazi party line also thought was a really good idea, because they wanted to get back to that traditional moral fabric of the Germans as having a strong, healthy family.
I guess I have two questions, but they're both related to intergenerational relationships in this environment of indoctrination and ideology and propaganda. One is, I'm just curious, so that, you know, there is a generation that has lived a different life, and now, as I understand, seems quite on par with what's happening as a fan base, as a followership. And to me, that means that they've had to give up on certain, I don't know, leisurely things in their life, certain freedoms, and how did the state go about making that maybe seamless or easier for them to manage and control. And then the other thing I want to ask is, and so comparing that to the generation that was born into this whole thing. And the other thing is the role of history lessons in the indoctrination of children, and the different history lessons that these generations had received. And while I understand that it's in an environment where probably critical thinking is not a thing, and, you know, collective forgetfulness is also there, I say this because not to compare Nazi Germany entirely with Iran, but I think I think all of us here come from a generation that were born into the Islamic Revolution. And I personally have had situations where my parents have been shocked by what I didn't know. For instance, about World War II in particular. I remember my mother has been ashamed of me not knowing and has wondered, what do we learn in school? And at the same time, knowing a lot about, let's say, Islamic history of a certain school. So, and it has created tensions between the two generations at times. So I'm just really curious how it was in the world about which we're talking about today.
Quite right. Of course, just probably as in Iran, you have people who lived in Weimar, Germany, who were used to getting all kinds of reading different newspapers from different political organizations. That's something we don't have in this country. A normal German might read 3 or 4 newspapers a day to get different viewpoints on that. And the Nazis were really good at shutting down all kinds of discourse. They gave people what was called a Volksempfänger, a people's receiver, which was a very simplified radio. And they gave it for free out to Germans so that every German could hear the Führer. What they couldn't hear was things like the BBC, because there was such a low bandwidth that you couldn't hear things from other countries. And so, there are still people who would listen to the BBC on their much more sophisticated radios. But the Nazis really worked towards limiting discourse wherever that occurs. But I wanted to get to the journalist's point on what about the parents? What did the Nazis give them? Do they give them a bone, as we would say in English? Do they give them something that they've given up some of these luxuries? They've given up some of this stuff. And I wanted to mention that the Nazis were really concerned. It was a terrorist state. There's no question about that. But the Nazis were also concerned about keeping people happy. And so one of the Nazis' programs that was especially common during peacetime, but even during wartime, was strength through joy, in German Kraft durch Freude. And so it was a way to get a lot of leisure activity for the working German. So they built, swimming pools. They had pleasure cruises on the Rhine and on the North Sea and these sorts of things. They offered vacations and all kinds of recreational activities to working adults as kind of a, feel-good way that they could bind with their communities and have this leisure activity. So that was something that the Nazis did for adults. That was kind of a popular thing.
To your second question about history is a really interesting one. As both Patricia and I are historians, we can talk about how we see that within Germany, when Hitler came to power, there was a re-emphasis on history. So history gained a larger prominence within the German school system. And also there were history lessons within the Hitler Youth. But it was a particular type of German history. It was a history that emphasized the background and today we would say it's a distorted view of the past based on folklore, glorifying medieval German kings who they saw as particularly Aryan, particularly German, very nationalistic type of history. And of course, within German schools and the Hitler Youth, the recent past was also portrayed differently. So World War I, which you remember at the 1918, when Germany surrendered during World War I, the Nazis considered that in post years as a stab in the back by the Jews. That if the German military had been given the right and been allowed to continue the war, they would have won. But instead, after the abdication of the Kaiser, the king of Germany, a socialist government came to power, and the Nazis blamed the socialists, who were also Jewish, as being the ones that contributed to the defeat and the demise of Germany. And then the subsequent Versailles Treaty, which took away Germany's military, it humiliated them according to the Nazi propaganda. And so this was taught then within the schools and became part of the lessons that the Versailles Treaty and the past needs to be righted. We need to come back strong. We need to show the world that we were not the defeated losers of World War I.
My question was about whether there was a kind of, you mentioned like that the cruises and all the leisure stuff, but were there people like who might not have necessarily believed in the ideology, but there was a system of rewards and privilege that they knew that if they joined the Nazis, even though they are intellectually or ethically might not be comfortable with it, and it's kind of like parallel like to Iran, and there are revolutionaries and that they are very dedicated, or they were dedicated at the beginning, but there are so many people that joined them, and they act the same as them. They wear the same type of clothing, but they might not be believers, but because of that system of privilege and rewards, basically they join them to basically not be isolated and make the best of it, basically. And to that extent, that was the case in Germany.
Definitely. I think there are as many reasons for joining the Nazi Party as there are for people. And we know from, for example, from the collapse of the communist Eastern Europe. We know so many people joined the Communist Party because that was a way to get ahead. And this was indeed the case for the Nazis as well. Joining the Nazi Party, of course, has benefits. There are all kinds of very positive policies. Like if you have a baby, the Nazis introduced things like Kindergeld, children's money. And I think there are also people who join because they see things wrong. Tim described that there was a lot wrong with Germany right before the Nazis come to power. There's political unrest. There's economic disaster. The Germans had been through hyperinflation in 1923 that wiped out people's savings, and then the Depression hits. And so there are always these people who say, the Nazis will bring, will bring order. The Nazis will bring political stability. The Nazis will bring back economic prosperity. And okay, I don't like them, but I'll hold my nose and vote for them.
What was the role that Hitler's cult of personality played in indoctrination of young people?
Hitler is considered the leader, the Führer, right? And the Führer is the party, and the party is the Führer, was a famous slogan. But when you look at the propaganda effort in which Hitler is positioned as the father of the country, there's posters of him as the doctor of the country, so he heals us. He is all encompassing. He's almost very much the godlike person. One of the things we see in the 1920s, late 1920s and 1930s before he comes to power is that as he's campaigning, he would use an airplane to fly to a political rally and land. And so there would have to be these mass political gatherings. And all of a sudden, out of the sky comes the airplane with the Führer, the leader, coming in to talk to the people. He'd talk, he'd mesmerize the crowd. We can't underestimate the power of his speeches at the time. I mean, I think today we look at these black and white movies of him, and he seems almost comical and almost maybe even farcical. But at the time, especially listening to people who were alive at that time, talking about how they were so encapsulated with and enraptured with his speeches. So he became the unifying father of the country for many people.
Ihr repräsentiert eine große Idee. Und wir wissen, dass für Millionen unserer Volksgenossen die Arbeit nicht mehr ein trennender Begriff sein wird, sondern ein alle gemeinsam verbindender. Und dass insbesondere keiner mehr dann in Deutschland leben wird, der in der Arbeit der Faust Minderes sehen wird als in irgendeiner anderen Arbeit. Durch eure Schule wird die ganze Nation gehen. Und ich weiß, so wie ihr in stolzer Ergebenheit diesem Deutschland Dienst tut, wird heute Deutschland in stolzer Freude seine Söhne in euch marschieren sehen.
I would like to wrap the session today with the same question that we asked Will, and I will ask both of you, because inevitably in this session, we compared the situation in Iran with the Nazi Germany, and we know that it's not accurate and we know that it's not the right thing to do, but it's inevitable to compare certain actions by the Iranian government with certain actions of the Nazi Germany. As a historian, Tim, how comfortable are you with such comparisons?
So what I try to, as a historian, to think about is I try to deconstruct or to think through what is the process that caused the hate or the anti-Semitism. How did it come about? So I think there are warning signs within the history that we can find and we know, and propaganda indoctrination of youth is definitely one of those warning signs that we look to. But I think that's what I draw on when I then take the history and look around at the world today. I look for those kind of universal trends and traits that come out of the past.
Thanks very much. What about you, Pатریشیا?
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation with the gentleman on one of our Facebook Live programs who studied in his case, radical right-wing movements. And one of the things that he says that radical movements have three things in common. They thrive, A, on the idea of belonging. With the Nazis, it's the idea of this superior race. We are this one thing. Two, the idea of an injury or a trauma. With the Germans, it's the loss of World War I, the loss of territories, limitation of its armies and air force, the war guilt, the heavy payments. And then there's the idea of exclusion of the other as a result of this, that we repay this injury by excluding that other. And with the Nazis, of course, it's a lot of groups. There are a lot of others, but clearly the ultimate other is the Jew. And that's something, there are all these particularities that come with Nazism and what they did. But those are hallmarks that perhaps we can watch with all radical movements and radical governments and see that perhaps playing out in almost every case.